In 2018, he fled Brazil after allegedly ending a man's life, only to be arrested in 2021 after brutally murdering his girlfriend in front of her children. Somehow, this year in 2023, he would escape prison, alarming authorities, the public, and horrifying his victims' families. Luckily, he was caught just a couple weeks after his escape, but I still can't help but wonder, how did this man evade authorities in multiple countries? Today we are going to discuss Danilo Cavalcante, his murders, and his disturbing escape from prison, to shed light on how no one should ever really be trusted. It's time to open a window and let the fresh air in. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome if you're new here. My name is Erin and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. On Tuesdays, I explore a true crime case, and on Saturdays or Sundays, I take a look at a cult or an extreme religion. I'm also dropping bonus videos on Thursdays in November and December in 2023, so if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you so much for your support on my recent videos about about Twin Flames universe. I really appreciate your support on that. And I have some really interesting videos on that topic coming up for you. So if you're here for more of that culty stuff, don't worry, I got you. This weekend, we have some new cult videos coming to you. I also like to suggest a book at the top of my videos, and today's book is one we've featured before. It's called The Wife Before. It's a really fascinating tale about this woman who finds the love of her life, or so she thinks. She moves to a remote area with him and begins to uncover a lot of mystery about his wife. Or is she missing? Or is she dead? Who knows? So it's a really great book. I highly recommend. And if you've read it, let me know what you think about it in the comments down below. So let's get right into this video. When word got out that convicted murderer Danilo Cavalcante had escaped a Pennsylvania prison on August 31st of this year, 2023, the community was terrified and rattled. He had been convicted of stabbing his girlfriend, Deborah Brandao, while her young children watched in horror nearby. Allegedly, he had committed this atrocious act because he was worried she would reveal one of his deepest, darkest secrets, a murder he had allegedly committed years prior in Brazil. But how did we get here? How has this monster been able to evade authorities so many times? I think a question we've all had before is, can we even fully depend on law enforcement to serve and protect us? Between politics, race issues, and the abuse of power we've sometimes seen, it can be difficult to blindly trust those in law enforcement. So when we hear stories like this one, it only makes us question whether or not the systems we currently have in place are effective or effective enough. In this story, we see that on a global scale. Danilo Cavalcante is a native of Brazil. Although we don't know much about his upbringing, it's alleged that he was friends with a man named, and I'm so sorry if I butcher this, I am terrible with a Spanish accent, Walter Jr. Moreira de Reis. Walter was just 20 years old and had become friends with Danilo. But on November 5th of 2017, that friendship would be tragically ended when Danilo allegedly shot Walter outside of a restaurant 5 times because apparently Walter owed him money. Apparently, the money was owed because of car repairs that had been made. So I can't imagine that it was like a significant amount of money. Not that any amount of money justifies murder. I'm just trying to illustrate the point that it seems as though Danilo had a bit of a short fuse. If being owed a few $100s, maybe a couple thousand, is enough to get him to shoot someone multiple times, I really can't imagine what else he's capable of if you really piss him off. 1 week later, a warrant was issued for his arrest. Of course, Danilo fled into a wooded area where he hid out for some time. And I can only imagine that in Brazil, escaping into the rainforest would be pretty easy because there's a vast amount of wooded area in the country, and there are still indigenous tribes living in the country. So, I just can't help but wonder if that kind of flows into the culture of the people in the country. Like maybe they know how to live off of the land for a certain period of time. In January of 2018, just 2 months after he allegedly killed a man, Danilo was able to flee Brazil. And the biggest question is how? The man has a warrant out for his arrest for murdering someone. So, how did this happen? Well, apparently, due to some kind of miscommunication between local authorities where the crime was committed and what would be, I think, our version of federal authorities, the National Warrant Registry in Brazil wasn't updated. So Danilo was able to flee to Puerto Rico. And look, I'm not going to kid myself and imply that I know how the Brazilian justice system works or imply that I have any type of solution for this problem because, look, I don't. I am not educated enough on this matter. And this is all my opinion and is all alleged. But in 2023, it just seems that this is a weird issue to have. I mean, we have AI for goodness sakes. We're worried about national security. How is there not an effective communication between local and federal authorities that is quick and up to date, or perhaps even automated and immediate so that the general public is protected from people like Danilo, who seem to have no moral compass whatsoever and an incredibly short fuse? It's just deeply, deeply concerning to me. And not just for the people of Brazil, but if this is happening in Brazil, I imagine it must be happening all over the world. So it's just really scary if you really think about it. So in January of 2018, Danilo fled to Puerto Rico and he somehow obtained a fake ID. So from there, he was able to make his way to Pennsylvania. He chose Pennsylvania because he had friends as well as a sister who already lived there. Soon after his arrival, he met a neighbor named Deborah Brandao, and they very quickly became an item. Deborah was 33 years old and had also grown up in Brazil. She had immigrated to the United States to try to provide a better life for her 2 children. She worked hard as a housekeeper to provide, and she was described as honest and compassionate. She just wanted to live the American dream and provide a better life for her children. But unfortunately, her plan would be thwarted when she got involved with Danilo. The two dated for about a year and a half, and he seemed to have a decent relationship with her and her kids. He seemed kind at first. He wasn't too overly affectionate with the children, but they seemed to like him. He and Deborah had a lot in common. They were both from Brazil and coming to the US for a better life. Deborah had been lonely in the United States. She didn't know many people, and she was a single mother, so the companionship with Danilo really helped her during this difficult transition. He seemed sweet, kind, and attentive. But soon, Danilo's mask would begin to slip. He started to become extremely jealous and controlling. He would have waves of jealousy that would lead to violence. I mean, he'd even threatened her with a knife before. Deborah was scared, and she tried to leave multiple times. I mean, she had 2 kids to look after. And I can only imagine that adjusting to a completely new country with a language barrier, there was a ton of culture shock, I'm sure. And then having to deal with a man like Danilo, I can't imagine how challenging that must have been for her. But luckily, she did have support here in the United States. Her sister Sarah, who she spoke to nearly every single day and confided in, just like Danilo had confided in her. See, Danilo had allegedly confessed to Deborah that he had killed a man back in Brazil. So the threat of Deborah leaving wasn't just because he was really obsessed with her and wanted to maintain control over her. She had collateral on him. She was actually in the power in this way in the relationship because she could get him arrested if she really wanted to. So when she tried to leave over and over again, he became more angry and more jealous and more violent. He constantly threatened her if she ever left him. And he even threatened to be extremely violent if she even entertained the idea of being with another man. Danilo could not afford to lose Deborah from his grasp or from his control. And the only way he could maintain control over her was by being violent. But one day, Deborah took charge. She couldn't take it anymore, and she knew what she was capable of. so she had to protect herself and her children at all costs. So in December of 2020, she decided to get a protective order against him. And this must have been such a stressful time for her. I mean, he was her neighbor, and at the time, the world was pretty much still shut down. So she probably felt so trapped. Where was she supposed to go? This scary man, who she's not quite sure what exactly he's capable of, lives next door to her, and her children can't really go anywhere. I mean, she must have just felt so desperate at the time. And a few months later, on April 18th, 2021, when Deborah was outside her home with her two children, Danilo arrived. He viciously grabbed her by her hair and violently threw her to the ground. Then, using a kitchen knife, he stabbed her 38 times while her children watched. According to her 7-year-old daughter, Danilo turned to the children and told them that he was going to do something bad to them. Then he pulled out additional knives from his backpack. The little girls started screaming in horror, and to try to get her to stop, Danilo threw a rock at her. So scared, her and her sibling ran to a neighbor's house, and that neighbor called 911 to the scene, thank goodness. The little girl said that once she was safely inside, she looked out to see Danilo fleeing the scene in a black car. This brave little girl and her younger sibling had so much to endure, so much trauma that is sure to haunt them for the rest of their lives. But there is a little bit of silver lining. Later during the trial, the 7-year-old daughter would actually testify in court, positively identifying Danilo as her mother's murderer, and ask that he be put in prison because tragically, this young girl had to watch her mother bleed out outside her very own front door. Thanks to this little hero, the little girl's witness statements, just hours later, Danilo would be caught attempting to flee the scene. He'd be caught in Virginia and was pulled over by Virginia State Police and was then extradited back to Pennsylvania. About a year and a half later, on August 16th of this year, 2023, Danilo would be convicted of murder after the jury deliberated for only 15 minutes. He would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But unfortunately, this is not the end of this story, because just about 2 weeks later, on August 31st, he would be able to escape Chester County Prison, a prison that had already experienced a similar escape just 3 months prior. In May 2023, Igor Vidra-Bolte, convicted of assaulting a police officer, managed to escape Chester County Prison for a second time. Apparently and allegedly, his first escape was in 2019, but there's really not much that can be found on this 2019 escape. But I do find it very shocking that this happened at the same prison with the same inmate twice. In his most recent escape, he managed to scale a wall, get on the roof of the prison, and then jump off the roof out of sight of officers or cameras. However, he was seen by an officer scaling the building, and that officer alerted other law enforcement. So Igor was subsequently apprehended just hours after his escape. Danilo used a similar means of escape, but no one on duty witnessed this attempt like they did with Igor Vidra-Bolte. So Danilo was able to effectively disappear, and a 14-day manhunt began. Apparently, an officer had even attempted to warn the acting warden a month prior that Danilo was a high risk for escape. He had allegedly evaded authorities before, and there was no doubt he would try to do so again, especially since he was facing a life sentence without parole. Security changes within this prison are only made when someone is deemed a flight risk and when they are leaving or arriving to the prison. So only during transport. Changes aren't made like within the prison itself. So let me get this straight. A few months ago, you had an inmate successfully escape your medium to maximum security prison. You've been warned that another inmate is likely to attempt to escape, and you know that he's actually escaped another country to avoid prosecution for murder before, allegedly. And you just kind of shrug it off? I mean, this is exactly why people lose faith in the system we currently have. It's one thing to have no idea about an escape or this being the first attempt, but you already had an inmate escape. You didn't apparently take any measures to heighten security just in general to prevent this from happening again. And then you're warned it might happen again, and you're like, we'll deal with it if it happens. Then it happens. I mean, this man is a pro at evading authorities and you just do nothing. He used basically the exact same escape route as Igor did just a few months ago. He's violent, he's unpredictable, and you're just like, we'll see. And suspiciously, the acting warden at the time, Howard Holland, actually resigned from his post the day before Danilo made his escape. He had been acting warden for several months and was even the special liaison to the prison's board during a several months long investigation that was being conducted at the prison. Interestingly, a year prior, the board of the prison had grown concerned, quote, about the leadership and operations, unquote, of this prison. The prison had even hired third-party consultants to evaluate the prison, with an unannounced inspection occurring in April of this year. There were several recommendations made, mostly involving the leadership and administration at the prison. Something the commissioner, Josh Maxwell, said in his statement confused me. He said that the corrective actions that had been expected to be taken weren't fully delivered until July, and then stated that the previous warden hadn't acted on those suggestions satisfactorily. But the timeline just doesn't really make sense to me. So you have an inspection in April, a convict escapes in May, suggestions for changes aren't delivered until July, and then Danilo escapes in August. But somehow this is all the previous warden's fault? I don't know about you, but something about this whole prison warden situation feels very suspicious to me. I'm just alleging, I'm not saying this is fact, but I just don't want to speculate too much because I don't know if there's an open investigation regarding this or who the new interim warden is. But I do find it odd that during this period of time these investigations are taking place, two criminals escape in the same prison, and then it's blamed on the previous warden, not the interim warden who was there during these escapes, during these investigations, who left the day Danilo escaped. The timing just feels a little too convenient for me. And there was recently a story about a group of convicts who escaped an Atlanta prison, and it's also rattled the community. It's been several weeks since the escape, and only 2 of the prisoners have been caught. I think that the crimes these 4 prisoners committed were all committed at different levels. I think one was a murderer. And honestly, it's just really concerning to think about how often this happens. I mean, a report in 2019 said that over 2,000 inmates had escaped prisons in the United States alone. It's just really scary to think about. I also read another story about another escaped convict in Pennsylvania of this year, and a couple found the man in their backyard. Their dog started barking at him. I think their backyard met woods or like a public path or something. And when the couple heard their dog bark, they looked outside and recognized this guy from seeing him in the media as an escaped convict. So then they alerted police. So how scary would that be? You're just trying to enjoy your day and you see an escaped convicted murderer right outside your house. I mean, it would be absolutely terrifying. But I guess it gives us all a reason to stay up to date on current local events so we can watch out for escaped convicts because it just feels like no one is safe. I mean, thousands of inmates escape prison every year, apparently. I just don't understand why this is happening or why it happens so frequently. And in Danilo's case, his victims' children were super vulnerable. Deborah's sister Sarah, who took custody of the children, still lived in the area. So she was terrified for herself and those children's lives. I can't imagine how scared she must have been for those 2 weeks. I mean, she truly must have been terrified. During those 2 weeks, Danilo committed a number of crimes while desperately trying to hide from authorities. He stole a van and drove to a friend's house 20 miles away to plead for refuge. He broke into a garage and stole a rifle before running off while the owner chased him down with bullets. I mean, what a nightmare for this community. One man said that he believed Danilo had been on his farm and stole granola bars and was hiding out on the property somewhere. Schools nearby were shutting down. I mean, people were terrified. Danilo is out in the woods somewhere, barely moving because he's afraid he's being tracked, And then he's somehow getting watermelon and apparently cracking them over his head when he got hungry enough because he didn't have a tool to open them with. I don't know why it's kind of a funny visual to me, but that's beside the point. By this time, 500 law officers, including the US Marshals, police, and even the FBI, were on the hunt. After tripping up a security system, search teams were alerted and began searching the nearby area. At around 1 a.m., a US EDA aircraft caught a heat signal moving around in the forest below. So, an armed tactical team rushed to the area, quietly rushing into the forest where Danilo hid. And he was still hiding under brush, barely moving, until suddenly, Yoda, a US border control dog, found him. The dog tried to get him and actually bit him on the scalp, and that's when officers found him and took him back into custody. So, not only now is he convicted of murdering his girlfriend, he also faces burglary charges and felony escape charges and will likely remain in prison for the rest of his life, providing closure and justice for Deborah and her family. Let's just hope they don't send him back to Chester County Prison. We're expected to trust law enforcement officers and believe in the law in this country. But it gets incredibly difficult to do that when it feels like justice isn't always being served and preemptive steps that could be taken to protect the general public aren't taken. Luckily, in this case, the fugitive was found. But what if he had committed another murder? What if he had harmed Deborah's children or sisters? It's these what ifs that should be enough to make changes within our system to prevent things like this from happening again. I truly hope that the necessary changes are made at Chester County Prison and other prisons around the country to prevent dangerous people from getting out. And I hope that now Sarah and Deborah's children can move forward and heal from this tragedy. My heart truly goes out to Deborah and her family. You did not deserve this, and I hope you can heal and that you have closure. Thank you all for spending time with me today. I really appreciate your support, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week, but please remember to stay safe out there. And keep your eyes peeled, stay alert and up to date with local news because you never know when an escaped convict might be in your back or front yard. So until next time, have a great day. Thank you again so much. Goodbye.